Then, in the 1970s, when PBL moved over to Maastricht, Maastricht really did not care about these humanist ideas, and they had not read any of these things. They were not interested. They just saw the method for what it was. What they were interested in is, how does PBL work? What are the underlying mechanisms of PBL? And to do that, they actually brought in their own, maybe you wouldn't call it philosophy, but intellectual foundations for PBL. And that was in constructivist psychology. So they brought in, especially, ideas that had come from, indirectly, Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky, which were two prominent psychologists of the 1920s, 30s, and then, well, Vygotsky died in the 1930s, but Piaget in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so forth. You have to bear in mind, I know that a lot of people try to assimilate Piaget and Vygotsky, but you have to bear in mind that they disagreed quite substantially, namely on the role of the social in learning. So Vygotsky was argued that the social played a prominent role, a predominant role even, in learning, particularly learning of language, whereas Piaget believed that was not the case and learning was egocentric. These two ideas were synthesized in the 1950s by an American psychologist called Jerome Bruner. Jerome Bruner was read with to quite some extent by a young researcher at Maastricht University called Henk Schmid. And it was Henk Schmid who decided to try to apply Bruner's theories, which were themselves borrowed from Piaget and Vygotsky, to PBL to see if there was a fit. And what he was particularly interested in was the idea of intrinsic motivation. That somehow PBL would motivate students to work, not for the sake of some external reward, but just because it was interesting. These ideas were further supported by another author of the time called Daniel Berlin, who worked also on motivation as a drive. Which is interesting because Daniel Berlin comes from the behaviorist school. But what he noticed is that animals don't just do things for food or for some kind of external reward, that they also will do things just because they're curious. And this led him to posit the existence of a curiosity drive, which then turned back into research on intrinsic motivation. The rest of Schmid's theories came from further constructivists. So we're talking here late 1970s, 1980s. A group of constructivists led by Richard Anderson and David Ausubel. And they looked at the role of prior knowledge in the acquisition of knowledge. They also looked at the role of semantic structures and at the role of elaboration in learning. And they set out these 5 golden rules of learning, which were: you have to have motivation, prior knowledge, the ability to structure or restructure knowledge, contextualization of knowledge, and then the ability to elaborate on what you have learned to encode in long-term memory. And then Schmid set about applying these 5 rules to PBL and seeing to what extent PBL fit. And then he noticed that PBL fit these 5 rules quite well, much better, in fact, than lecture-based or any other kind of pedagogy. And so he built his entire scientific justification of PBL around these intellectual ideas. And I asked him, well, where did you get the idea to look at prior knowledge? Because Schmid had never read Piaget or Vygotsky. So I asked him, where did you get this idea from? And he said, from Karl Popper. Karl Popper was an Anglo-Austrian philosopher of science whose ideas about science involved a concept which is familiar to most philosophers of science called falsification. The idea that you can never prove something to be true inductively, but you can falsify. And how does science progress, according to Karl Popper? By changing existing theories. So you have existing theories, you assess them, find them to be wanting, develop a new theory, and then you have a new theory, which then becomes the next theory that you disprove or falsify. but you have to start somewhere. And Popper was opposed to the idea that we were blank slates. So he was against the tabula rasa theory of empiricists. And so here you have this idea that you need prior knowledge in order to solve a problem. And so that was very much the Maastricht school of thought.